Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for both the PowerBasic Console and Windows compilers. Today, we will look at SQL Tools, an add-on from Perfect Sync Software, and connecting to multiple databases. In our last video, we looked at using SQL Tools to connect to a single database. In this video, we will look at connecting to multiple databases using the SQL Tools library. And we will create a generic library to provide a solid foundation to build upon. In this series of videos, we'll be covering topics which are common to both the PowerBasic Windows compiler and the PowerBasic Console compiler. In order to do this, I've set up a small common library to allow us to display information on the screen from a program regardless of whether you're using the Windows or the Console compiler. There are three basic functions in this common display library. There's prep output, log, and wait. At the end of our last video, we had successfully connected to a SQL Server database. What we're going to do today is to connect to more than one database. Now, in this video, as in the last, we're going to be using the SQL Tools Pro library, linked in with a code as a PBLib file. We'll also be expanding upon our own generic functions library to add more functions and to give us a solid foundation on which to build. So let's have a look at the code. Previously, we had used the SQL authorize function to make sure we had a valid license for SQL Tools. We then called the SQL initialization to set up the library for use. And then we had prepared a connection string to connect to our SQL Server database. Now there were two options. We could either use a username and password, which is a SQL username and password set up in the database, or we could use a trusted connection whereby our Windows sign-on was already set up in the database as a privileged user. What we'll be using today is the trusted connection. So we'll just comment this piece of code out. And our method of connecting to the database was to use the OpenDB function inside the SQL Tools library. And this quite successfully allowed us to connect to the database. This approach is fine if you're only connecting to a single database. In your code, if you need to connect to two databases, we need to use the expanded version of the command. Now it's worth at this point of having a quick look at the help file that ships with SQL Tools. The help file is a useful resource in discovering what you can actually do with the library. First of all, we'll have a quick look at the difference between the SQL Tools Standard library and the SQL Tools Professional library. Apart from the limitations to the number of databases you can actually open with SQL Tools Standard, the SQL Tools Professional library does contain a large number of additional features which you will find really useful if you're using this in a development environment with many databases. If we have a look for the SQL Open Database, we'll find that the function which we use to open the database has two forms. It has the long form, SQL Open Database, and the short form, SQL OpenDB. Now, in the last video we used SQL OpenDB to open a database because we were only opening a single database. What we're going to be using today is the long form of the function, which has additional parameters. So, if we want to replace this call we've got in our code with the long form of the function, this takes an additional parameter initially, which is the number of the database you wish to open. Now, the SQL Standard can open two databases, and the SQL Professional can open 256 databases. However, since this is the first database we're actually opening, we'll mark it as number 1. The next parameter is your connection string, just as we had in the SQL OpenDB function. And the parameter after that is our prompt. So it's a minor change to the call, comment these two lines out, this would work quite nicely. However, for tidiness sake, you may want to actually create a constant for the number. This makes your code so much more readable, especially if you're opening perhaps say 5 databases during the run of the program. Always knowing which database is which is always an advantage. So we'll create a constant to handle that. Since we'll be opening more than one database, we will create a couple of constants. One for our FoodDB database, and one for another database we haven't looked at yet, called YouTube Projects. So if we take that constant and slot that in, it becomes more obvious which database we're actually attempting to open. So just as there are 2 forms of opening a database, there are also 2 forms of closing a database. Now, as we saw in the last video, the SQL shutdown will close down all open databases. So this one single line would effectively close down the database or databases we had open. But if you wish to close a single database, there is an expanded form of the close DB, which is close database. And as before, it takes a parameter, in this case the number of the database to close down. So if we slot that in, that will close our database quite happily. So if we try compiling and running our code, there is our database connection. So functionally we haven't actually changed the program, we just enabled the use of a different function to open a numbered database. Now, one thing we might want to do, since we'll be doing a lot of opening and closing databases, is to create a generic function whose job it is to open our database. Now, what we've done here is we have opened a database, got back a result from the function, tested the result to make sure it is a success or not a success, and then printed a message out to our log to say it's connected or not connected. Since in databases we'll be doing a lot of database work, we'll want to structure this. Let's create a global array for our databases. We'll put this into our generic library. This will hold the name of each database we wish to connect to. And at the beginning of our PB main, we will populate this array. We'll set this array up for 2 databases because that's what this program is going to connect to, and we will name each of the databases. Now, taking this approach does make some of our code a little tidier. In here in our connection string, we'd actually named our database explicitly. If we replace that with this, that way our database name is taken from the array. And in this case, this will bring up the food database, which is food store. So now that we've tidied that up, let's create a generic function whose job it is to open any database we pass it. So effectively we want to encapsulate this functionality in a function. So let's create a new function whose job it is to do that. Now we're going to need some parameters here. Now the idea behind this function is it will return either a true or a false. True if we've successfully managed to connect to the database, false if we have not. And we'll be using the str status string to pass back the status of the connection or lack of. So just as we did before, we're going to create a long result variable, and this is going to allow us to call the open database command with our database handle, our connection string, and the fact that we don't want to prompt the user for any input. Now obviously we want to test to see whether that has worked or not, and what we're doing here is we're testing the value of long result which we get back from the open database call. It's either going to be success or success with information if it had successfully connected, And what we'll pass back for the status is the name of the database, since we know the handle number, which points to the location in the array for the name of the database, and we can say the database has been opened successfully. We'll return true from the function, and if we fail to open the database, we will pass back again the name of the database, plus a call to the function we prepared in the last video, which will return the errors. So if we use this function in our code, we can tidy up our code considerably. We will create a new local variable for the status, and we will call the new function we have just set up. Now we need to pass it the parameters, in which case is the handle for the database we want to open, which is this one, our food database. We will pass our connection string, which we have already set up. And we will pass our status variable to pull back the information we expect to get back from that function. And if the database has been opened successfully, we have the option of throwing our message out to the log. And any other code we wish to follow can appear at this point. Now, should we be unsuccessful in connecting to the database, we put out exactly the same information, which means all this code in here can go quite happily. So we now have something quite generic that opens our database and will return a status. So if we try running our code now, once I've actually set the variables up, of course, and there we go. It has given us the name of the database, told us it's opened successfully, and is ready to exit. So since we have a generic routine to connect to the database, it seems quite logical we would want a generic routine to disconnect from the database, effectively using this command. So we'll create a function just to do that. Now this function does exactly the same as the open database one. It will take in the database handle, and it takes in a variable which we're going to pass back as the status, the result of our operation. And we will pass back again a true or false. So we will use the call to the closed database function, and if it's successful, we will report that the named database has closed. If it does not, then we will give the errors. I can't think of any error immediately that would allow you to not close a database, but it's always possible. Now, if we put the call to our new function in, and again we would want the handle of the database for closing, and we would want our status. And if we wish, we can throw those messages out to a log quite happily. The advantage of this is if you're actually opening a database, performing some function, closing the database down, the name of the database would always be logged every time it's opened and closed. That way when you're checking a log later on, you can actually see exactly what the program did. You can also amend your log to put things like the date and time into the log, which again is useful. So if we run our program now, it will quite happily open the database and then close the database and throw the messages out to the log. And there we are. Database opened successfully and closed successfully. So how do we open a second database? Well, let's work on the assumption that once we've opened our first database, we only want to open the second database if the first database has been successful. So down here, we know that the database has been opened successfully, so we can attempt to open our second database. So we will need a connection string to the second database. So if we prepare a connection string, in this case, again, it's still going to be a SQL Server database. It will still be a trusted connection, although depending on your own personal databases, it could be a named user and password. And in this case, we're connecting to the second database, which case is the YouTube projects database. So again, we'll want to do exactly the same as we did before. We want to test to see if the database has been opened successfully. In this case, we're passing the other variable for the database handle. And again, we'll be putting out to the log the status in both conditions, just to see whether we have or haven't been able to connect to the database. So here will be our second database opening. Now the difference with this is our first database will be opened and then our second database will be opened. So at this point in time, down here, we'll have two concurrent connections going to databases. So at the very end of our code, where we close everything down, we will want to close both databases. So we'll just clone this code. And we'll put this in. Now, as I said before, you don't actually have to close down the databases individually, because the SQL shutdown command will close all open databases for you anyway. But this is just put in for the point of view of completeness, just so that should you need to close a database during the running of your code, for example, perhaps only checking a database once an hour, you can open it, do what you need to, and then close the database. These functions will work quite nicely. So what we're doing here is we're opening the first database. If that database is opened successfully, we will attempt to open the second database. So let's run the code now. There's the code running. So it has successfully opened the food store database, then the YouTube projects database, and then it's closed the food store one, and then closed the YouTube projects one. So if we wish to test out a failure, let's go in and effectively put an additional character in here, so it should be unable to open the food database. And just for clarity, since we put messages in to say that databases are closed successfully, let's put a message in to say it's not. And we'll do the same for the open. Just so it's completely clear what function it's trying to do. And if we try running our code, we missed an ampersand out. And we've missed one there as well. Oh, yep. Right. Is that close enough? Right, let's try that now. Right, there we go. So, we attempt to open the food store database, and the food store one is unable to open, so it gives you an error. So the food store database is unable to open, and then we do not attempt to open the YouTube database, but we attempt to close the food store database. Again, we can't close it because it's not open. And we then attempt to close the YouTube projects database, and again we can't close it because it's not open. So our code is fairly robust now. It's handling both connections and it's handling errors quite nicely. So what we'll do in our next video is we will look at actually getting information out of our databases. But that's it today. We've established a reasonable foundation on which we can build our SQL statements. Thank you for watching.